The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
Today I'm talking about what is often referred to as AGCC, which is Anthropogenic Climate Change. Let me just say at the outset that I think this will dovetail nicely with what we've heard from the incredible raft of speakers that have preceded me. I've rarely been to a conference in which there were, at least so far, no duds. And I hope I ain't the dud. But anthropogenic climate change, I want to make clear that I don't normally talk about global warming unless I mean global warming specifically. And the reason for that is to prevent the confusion that results from the fact that although anthropogenic climate change, anthropogenic, we're significantly responsible for it. It is human caused in significant measure. Although anthropogenic climate change does involve a mean increase in the planetary temperature, there are lots of places where if the computer scenarios play out, and there are many, many different models that are very strongly convergent, they vary in details, but they all point to the same set of very unfortunate consequences, and we're also observing real effects even as I speak, but some places will get colder. Right? And some places will get warmer. And you're going to hear people say, I'm going to begin this talk, or shortly I'm going to get into it and talk. Before I talk about the science, I'm going to talk about denial. And where's the denial coming from and why? I think that's going to be more instructive than going through all the details of global warming. You're all very well instructed in all of that, and we'll rehearse some of it, but that's not going to be the bulk of my presentation. We're going to talk about the phenomenon of denial and what that is, and you're going to hear from the deniers and the skeptics. How can you possibly believe in global warming when Buffalo just had a record snowfall? Well, this is a complete misunderstanding of the nature of human-caused or anthropogenic climate change. It's also a fundamental misunderstanding of a very important difference, and it's the difference between climate and weather. And let me just tell you right now, a handy-dandy way to think about the difference between climate and weather is that climate is what we expect, and weather is what we get. Right? That's a big difference. We can predict climate, and we can do that in a very effective way. We learned, and John Algeo made reference to this last night, it was only last night, it seems longer ago, when he talked about the butterfly effect, and an extraordinary climate scientist, a man named Edward Lorenz, who talked about the butterfly effect. Actually, his graph, his model of weather prediction represented, or I mean didn't represent, but it resembled the pattern of a butterfly on a piece of paper, and that's what got him thinking about butterflies. But Lawrence was part of a program, in the 60s, a major, heavily funded government program that was designed to push weather prediction as far as possible. And scientists who were working on that program were confident that they could do 100 days, maybe 200 days, maybe a year, maybe more, in very accurate prediction, not of the climate, not of the general tendencies of climate, but of weather. But the discoveries that were made by Lawrence, particularly, and others, have led to the conclusion, as John pointed out, it also was the beginning of what we today call chaos theory, although most of the people that work in chaos theory no longer call it chaos theory, they call it complexity theory, because people misunderstood seriously what they were engaged in. Why is it you're trying to foment chaos? No, we actually just study complexity. But what Lawrence concluded was that it was unlikely that we would ever be able to predict the weather farther out than 5 days. It's not a matter of better computers. It's not a matter of better models. It's a matter of the near infinite complexity of the weather and something that chaoticians among you will know as sensitive dependence on initial conditions. It means a slight change in your starting position can have enormous consequences down the road, hence the butterfly flapping its wings in Outer Mongolia and changing the weather in Kankakee, Illinois. Anthropogenic climate change we'll talk about. That's going to have remarkably different effects on weather around the world, but in general, it does mean a mean warming of the planet. Normally, when I talk about this subject, and I talk about a lot of different subjects, but when I talk about this subject, and it has been an area of concern and study for me, largely growing out of my work with interreligious communities around the world. I've been involved in interreligious action for a long time, and the focus has been to work with different communities to try to help them engage problems of social and economic justice and human rights, ecology, women's rights, that sort of thing. And so I've been involved in the study and to a significant degree in activism about global climate change for a long time. And normally when I talk about it, I do sort of concentrate on the facts and the factoids and so on. But I thought not so much here today. What I'd like to do instead is take you through 7 questions. And I'm going to do something that has often backfired on me. I'm going to tell you in advance what the questions are. The reason it's backfired is that I announced that I'm going to do 7. Time is up, and I've done 2. And I have to say, those others are really good questions, too. Take them home and cogitate. So I'll try not to do that. These are questions, 7 questions, that I think really do bear on the extraordinary range of ideas that have been presented to us, that has been presented to us, the extraordinary range. John Aljo talking about, first about the difference and then about the sameness of spirituality and spiritual practice and social action. Spiritual action, if you will, practice and action. Ed Tick talking so powerfully and so movingly about woundedness, and then so excitingly about initiation and healing and so on, and suggesting in one of the lines that I really grabbed onto, that at a time when we are suffering from a variety of environmental woes, but most particularly this whole threat of climate change, that we're in our own period of terror, and maybe we are suffering in a sense from post-terror soul distress, from post-traumatic stress disorder. Then Jamal Rahman talking so powerfully about finding common ground and about, in a sense, shedding the kind of identity boundaries that limit our thinking. They limit, of course, our relationship to one another, but they limit our thinking and they limit our cooperative, intercultural, interspiritual address to the great problems that face us. And his very hopeful talk that that's something we can feel better about and get better at. And finally, Gene Houston's remarkable conversation about social, and I would say social and spiritual activism. What does it mean to be a social and spiritual activist? What does it mean? And it means, well, I believe that this whole business of anthropogenic climate change presents an extraordinary opportunity, an extraordinary place for us to come together culturally to bridge gaps of gender, of culture, of language, of religion, of ethnicity, of education, and so on, and to cooperate in a project that is worthy of this extraordinary, extraordinary moment in human history where we find ourselves poised. I couldn't agree more with Jean when she says we are on the threshold of a major, major shift. There is such a thing as cultural evolution, and it moves on a time scale that puts biological evolution to shame. Biological evolution plods unnoticeably. Cultural evolution can leave you in the dust if you turn your attention for a day. And we are in one of those extraordinary, epical, rare but powerful moments of accelerated human cultural evolution. I believe that we're in a time when we have the potential, when there is the potential for our values and our spirituality and our ways of relating to each other and to the whole planetary community, have the potential to come to move closer and closer to sync with planetary realities. So many of our values are out of sync with realities, are the values that bear on our treatment of the earth, the values that bear on our treatment of our valuation of women. For how long did we assume, and quite wrongly, that women were radically inferior to men? And for how long did we assume, and quite wrongly, that the earth was simply unfragile? That there was nothing you could do to the earth that could possibly damage her. Do you understand that 100 years ago, you were the rare bird indeed? Well, the birds might have known. I know the frogs knew, but the birds might have known. But you were a rare person if you believed that it was possible to throw enough junk into the oceans to make a difference. I doubt very much that I would have been one of those persons. And I don't think I would have had that kind of insight 100 years ago to say, you know, we're going to reap the whirlwind here. We're doing something that is very dangerous and very wrong and very out of sync. We always credit native peoples, indigenous peoples, with that kind of insight. And there's a fair degree of romanticization there because there's no shortage of stories of indigenous peoples that completely, not maliciously and not in the same wanton way that we've done it, but simply because they didn't know any better, they laid waste their landscapes and so on. We're at an extraordinary time when we're realizing that patriarchy is not only wrong in a moral sense, it just doesn't fit with planetary realities. And ecocide doesn't fit with planetary realities. And social and economic injustice and systematic violation of human rights doesn't fit with the reality. Leave the moral question aside, but only for a moment. Bring it back, because it is a moral issue and it is a moral question, but just think of the practical implications. So here are those 7 questions. You see why I say I should never list the 7 questions. I'm just arriving at them. Here's my promise. We're going to talk about these. What is the spiritual challenge? Why the denial? Right? What's good science? What's bad? That's all one question. And what about Al? I know you're all wondering if I will address that, and so I promise you right in the middle, the 4th of 7 questions is the what about Al question. It's one close to my heart. What's the reality is the 5th question. What's the hope is the 6th. And finally, to sort of come full circle, what is our spiritual response? What's the spiritual response, or what's a spiritual response? And when I ask the first question, what's the spiritual challenge, I turn to someone who has made a huge difference in my thinking, in my life, someone I met at the first Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago, which I was with, by the way, until 2002, in Chicago in 1993, and that's Thomas Berry. Thomas Berry is, as far as I'm concerned, the most powerful voice for ecological sanity I have ever heard. You know, he's a Passionist priest in his 80s now, and he doesn't call himself a theologian, but rather a geologian. And I've always loved that. And Thomas Berry says, our spirituality itself is earth-derived. Our spirituality is earth-derived. If there is no spirituality grounded in the earth, then there is no spirituality in ourselves. Thomas argues that we are at the threshold, I'm just going to read this little part, the rest I won't. We are at the threshold of a new revelation in our understanding of the origins of the universe and in our evolutionary understanding of human nature. A new common ground, he says, for science and religion, and I might add, for practice and action, as John Aljo was saying last night, has become possible. A new common ground for science and religion, practice and action, has become possible in the emergent view of the universe as a vital, interdependent, dynamic reality. We urgently, Thomas continues, we urgently need a new spirituality, quote, grounded more deeply in the numinous dimension, the mysterious numinous dimension of an emergent, evolving universe. I should add, an emergent, evolving universe that doesn't evolve and emerge as we watch, but co-evolves with us, with our choices, with our consciousness, and so on. He goes on to say that the language of redemption-oriented spirituality has ceased to be effective, that we're lost and damned and we need to be rescued and pulled out externally, ceases to be effective in our contemporary world and may indeed widen the gap between human and environmental concerns. And finally, Jean mentioned Father Teilhard, again, a huge influence on so many of us. When Marilyn Ferguson wrote that remarkable book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, longer ago than you want to remember, because we're all way older than we think, but a long time ago. Pardon? 1979. I know the year, but I was sort of sparing us all. Yeah. In the back, there's a little appendix, and it was contained the results of a survey of, I think a couple hundred people with whom she had corresponded, and asked who was the most influential thinker in your movement into what was calling itself the New Age. And people talked about Jung and Einstein and a whole host of Aurobindo. But the number one person named was Teilhard de Chardin. And drawing on the insights of Teilhard de Chardin, Tom Berry argues, quote, that the earth has an intrinsic spiritual quality from the beginning. And this spiritual quality finds a distinctive expression in the human mode of being. It's as though the earth finds its voice and its eyes and its legs and so on in a special way in the human community. For Thomas, the primary problem facing humans today is the human attitude that we as a species are somehow essentially disengaged from the earth on which we live, and that our destiny is to bend nature to our own purposes. He goes on to tell us how that's working out, but I don't think I need to tell you how that's working out. So now this gets into the anthropogenic global climate change thing. And instead of beginning with the physical science of climate change, I want to begin with the political science of denial and ask, why is it that recent polls, and this is 2 years ago, and I have reason to believe that that has changed dramatically. In fact, I know it to be the case that it has changed dramatically. But as recently as 2 years ago, upwards of 50% of Americans, when asked about global climate change, or they were asked about global warming, responded that they were fairly confident that the scientific community was roughly evenly divided on the question. Now that is absolute hogwash, which is a technical scientific term that is used to describe data that is beyond questionable all the way to goofy, which is another technical term. I don't want to burden my talk with too many technical terms, but those you can grab. And here's the interesting thing. Nothing could be clearer than the fact that the lesson that has been learned by the architects and orchestrators of denial, and don't imagine that it's not organized. It's organized, it's funded big time, number one funder of most of the organizations that are fully committed to the denial industry is ExxonMobil. There's a paper trail that's a mile long, a mile wide. There's no doubt about it. But the lesson that has been learned, and this is extraordinary, is a lesson that was learned from big tobacco. And big tobacco, as Henry Waxman and his committee discovered, remember that scene when you've got, was it the 7 or 8 heads of the big tobacco companies all together lying in unison and with what passed for straight faces? The jury is out. There is no proof. And the members of the committee and their expert witnesses are saying, but there's gigantic scientific convergence on this issue. But there is no proof. I want to suggest to you that that is a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of science. Science in general does not prove things. Science disproves things. You can work forever, as the great philosopher of science, Karl Popper, argued. You can work forever and you'll never prove the truth of a scientific theory. What you can do is, if that theory is weak, is disprove it, and then you can move on, right? Science advances with the creation of hypotheses. Hypotheses suggest predictions, make predictions. Those predictions then suggest tests that can be made. We perform the tests. If the predictions are validated, then that's one more piece of supporting evidence that suggests that this is a healthy theory. Right? But that's as close as we'll ever get. Theories approach truth, as the mathematician would say, asymptotically. You know, the curve that gets ever closer to that axis, to that line, but never reaches it. Right? Theories never arrive at proof. The theory that the sun comes up every morning on a regular schedule is pretty reliable. I have found it very useful in organizing my life. Right? But if I had to know for certain that tomorrow the sun is going to rise at the predicted time, or else I wouldn't plan for the day or get up, well, that'd pretty much be the end. Right? You can't ever prove that, but you could disprove it. If tomorrow the sun comes up at 11:30, we have to recalibrate the ephemeris. Right? We have to do some serious explaining and some serious investigative work. That's important to know about science. But big tobacco, what was the lesson that we learned? Big tobacco, and we've got a stack of memos from the big companies saying our mission, our product is doubt. Right? What we have to sell is doubt. Doubt about the nature of science, doubt about the scientific evidence, doubt about the proof, doubt about the link, and so on. How many of you believe that there's still doubt about the link between cigarette smoking and a variety of physical conditions, including lung cancer? How many of you believe that Holocaust denial of the events of the Holocaust in World War II, how many of you believe that Holocaust denial is good history? Anybody want to rise to that page? The next question I actually had someone say yes to recently, and it sort of threw me off. So even if you think the answer is yes, be gentle. How many of you believe that the link between HIV and AIDS is not founded? I'll tell you somebody who does believe that, doesn't believe it, but argues that, Thabo Mbeki, who is the president of South Africa. Why would Thabo Mbeki deny the connection between HIV and full-blown AIDS? Because 25%, it's a horrible statistic, 25% of the people of South Africa are HIV positive. And if that's the case, then think how many of those are pregnant women. And if they're pregnant and they're HIV positive, then untreated, their children, their babies are very likely to be born with HIV, and to understand the slippery slope, the awful, the nightmare that ensues, and yet the drugs are available that can dramatically reduce the incidence of HIV-positive babies born to HIV-positive mothers, but the drugs are expensive. They're way expensive. And so Thabo Mbeki presides over a shaky financial situation. South Africa is better off than many African nations, and yet it is politic and expedient for him to deny the connection between HIV and AIDS. And here's the really horrible thing, and that is that there is no shortage. Well, there is a shortage, but he has been able to find compliant scientists that will testify with a straight face that the jury is out on the HIV-AIDS connection. Has it been absolutely proven? No. Science operates in terms of stochastic processes. Another technical word, that really is one. That means we argue from probability. Right? So we can say, will this child of this HIV-positive mother, or will this HIV-positive person eventually have full-blown AIDS? Can science answer that? No, science can't answer that one-to-one specific question any more than science can say, did global warming cause Katrina? Did global warming cause the San Francisco wildfires? Did global warming cause, and so on? And you're going to get from the scientific community, well, we don't know. But do you understand, the media doesn't stay tuned long enough to hear the scientists say, however, right? However, whether global warming caused the wildfires or whether HIV will lead to full-blown AIDS in this one person, we can tell you that the rise in HIV infection in a community guarantees, absolutely 100% certainty, guarantees the rise in the number of cases of full-blown AIDS. And the climate scientists can tell you that whether the wildfires in California were definitively caused by global warming, climate is much too complex. They were caused by all sorts of things, from pavement to everything, to a 10-year-old kid, right, who was also involved. I heard some homeowner interviewed who said, well, you know, I was really angry until I found out it was just a kid. What are you going to do? And I'm thinking, okay, this guy is well along the bodhisattva path. You know, I mean, give him his halo. He's okay. But just don't put me in his shoes. I'm not ready. Okay, so you get what I'm saying. The climate scientists can say, we don't know about this wildfire, but we can tell you this. In this wildfire, you see the shape of things to come, and there's no doubt about that. In Katrina, you see the future of hurricanes. Can we say this hurricane caused or that hurricane caused? No, science doesn't work that way. Science does say, however, that what we can expect from global climate change and from global warming is a warmer ocean surface temperature. You probably already know that hurricanes can only happen if ocean surface temperature reaches 81. You don't get any hurricanes spawned at 80 degrees or 80.5. It takes 81. But when a hurricane passes over, is formed, or a tropical storm, and it passes over water whose surface temperature is 82 or 83 or 85 or 88, it gets stronger, right? Will we have more hurricanes? We don't know. There's division about that, but we will certainly have stronger hurricanes and stronger tornadoes and more wildfires and so on. That's the way, do you understand? I'm just saying we misunderstand and misrepresent science when we say, where's the proof? How many of you believe that creationism and intelligent design give a good account of cutting-edge biology? Then I feel pretty good about asking the next question. How many of you are comfortable with the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old? And yet, for all of these positions, including the position that the flat Earth is the center of the universe, right? There are scientists, let the record show that I use the ultimate postmodern gesture, the air quote, right, to indicate the scientists. There are scientists that will swear, and they are well-paid scientists in most regards. I'm not so sure about the flat earthers. It's interesting that the Flat Earth Society, I just want to tell you, has a website, and it's pretty good. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. And then it dawned on me, of course, they've got a 16-year-old. Somebody's grandson designed the website for them. But never mind. There are people who will have their names put on the letterhead. And there are people who will testify that the jury is out on HIV AIDS, that it's quite possible that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, that evolution is giant scientific misunderstanding, or worse, a hoax. A hoax, that's what the Discovery Institute in Seattle, an organization that is ground zero, if you will, of creationism and intelligent design theory. I'm very open to the idea that the universe has some intelligence going on in it, and that it might have a role in design. But the intelligent design theory is a theory that says current biological science is completely unable to explain the complexity that the biological world presents to us, and that's simply not so. The Discovery Institute, which chagrined Bill Gates, when he discovered that he had some years ago given them about $1 million when he didn't know who they were. They were just a think tank in Seattle. There weren't too many to choose from, and he gave them the money. But in any case, each of these causes, if you will, and certainly anthropogenic global climate change, has a raft of scientists, right, that will stipulate to it. It's easier to deal with the biology-denying scientists that are on the staff of the Discovery Institute, or at least on the letterhead. A lot of them have PhDs in biology and related fields from institutions that do not possess departments in those areas, which is problematic. But it's not so easy. It's not so easy to deal with the climate change deniers. There aren't that many, right, professional climate change deniers. There are about 20 names that come up regularly. If you follow it, you've certainly run into the Danish statistician Bjorn Lomborg, who used to deny it and now says, no, it's happening and it's probably human caused, but so what? No big deal, not a big problem. We just have to shift a few agricultural zones here and there. Everything will be fine. And wouldn't you like to have warmer winters anyway? Fred Singer is another. This is a guy with some scientific credentials. Frederick Seitz, Patrick Michaels, a long list of others. The American Enterprise Institute, the George Marshall Institute, the Global Climate Institute. These are some of the major ones, and they're the names that come up again and again and again. I will tell you this, that for the last several years, and I'm going to propose, if I have time at the end, and certainly in the breakout session tomorrow, I'm going to suggest a number of things that we might all consider doing. And one of the exercises that I'm going to recommend that falls under the category of clarification, just as John Aljo yesterday spoke about study and meditation and practice as the three keys to any spiritual tradition, I immediately resonated with that because for a long time I've been talking about clarification, centering, and service. I don't see much difference. Study, meditation, practice, clarification, centering, and service. But part of the clarification exercise that I will recommend and discuss with people tomorrow is that you really familiarize yourself with the best arguments of the skeptics, right? The best arguments of the climate change deniers, and then take it as an exercise once a week or once a month or whenever you have time to deal with one of them. And I promise you that you will find, with not that much effort, that every objection you ever find to the whole hypothesis of anthropogenic global climate change can be powerfully countered to your satisfaction. I've never met one yet. Right? Not that I couldn't immediately respond to, but one that I couldn't find a satisfactory analysis, dissection, and countering of. You know, if you're talking about, for example, the Holocaust, this is one of the problems of the whole enterprise of denial. And somebody jumps up in the back of the room and says, are you aware that the entire energy output of the regions in which the Nazis had their crematoria could not possibly have accounted for the number of dead that were supposedly cremated and processed? Well, do you understand, if somebody throws a question like that at you, you are not ready. You do not have the statistics at your fingertips to say, no, you're distorting German industrial production, and I have that right here. No, but do you understand, if you take a moment the next day or the day after that and do a little research, you'll find exactly where that bogus argument came from. I ran into one the other day, which is this. Do you realize that NASA has just now apologized for its earlier statement that 1998 was the warmest year on record? Turns out it was 1934. Take that, alarmists. Take that, Al Gore. What about Al? We'll get to Al. You have figured out, have you not, that that was the Al I promised you? And what about this 1934? So I went to the NASA website and I was digging around and digging and digging. I had to drill quite a bit before finally I found a paper that mentioned 1934. And it was a paper saying, it was a paper by James Hansen, who is the global climate change guy, the one who announced to the Senate in 1988 that we were in deep trouble, the one that the current White House has tried very hard to silence. You know, they put a 22-year-old in charge of editing and all the press releases from NASA. And this kid chopped out whole paragraphs and pages out of everything that anybody said about global climate change until they finally found out that he didn't, you know, he was a humanities major, which is okay. Nothing wrong with that, but you don't put him in charge anyway. But it was Hansen talking about the fact that here comes, and he was writing in 1999, saying, here's 1999, and just as we thought, it's going to be warmer than 1998. So I was interested in that. Obviously, what's interesting is this 1934 thing is very recent. Michelle Malkin and others, bloggers on the right, have been writing about it and saying, well, there you go, NASA apologized. Well, they didn't apologize at all. What happened is that in this paper by Hansen, and it's a paper that's 8 years old, Hansen is saying 1999 is going to be warmer than 1998. For your information, 1998, nobody claims is the warmest year on record. The warmest year on record in 2005 became 2005. And in 2006 became the warmest year on record. Of the 10 warmest years for which we have records, all 10 are in the last 15 years. So that's significant. But what about 1934? I'm just puzzled. And it turns out that 1934 is the warmest year on record in the United States. Any idea why that might be? The Dust Bowl. It was the Dust Bowl. And why the Dust Bowl? For the same reason that if you look at a graph of mean planetary temperatures, it goes like this, right? Okay. It goes, for every year, it goes up and down and up and down. The important thing, by the way, about that graph that you might not have caught is that although it goes up and down every year, the curve itself climbs steadily and rapidly across all the years for which we have records. There is no drop of this graph. It just goes up like that. And we could also draw another graph, just for your information, of global temperature. Of global temperature to match. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. I said global climate change. It's a graph of CO2 in the atmosphere, up and down and up and down. And then we draw the temperature graph, and it follows it exactly. So the more CO2 in the atmosphere, you understand this, the sun's rays that come in that would normally be reflected back off the atmosphere, a significant portion of them are trapped in the atmosphere. They get through, and they're not allowed to bounce out. But a big part of the bouncing off has to do with variations, well, the impact, how much CO2 gets stuck in the atmosphere has to do, first of all, with how much gets absorbed by greenery. Well, do you know, every year there's a cycle, isn't there? Every year in the spring and summer, we green up, right? And you might say, well, wait a minute, it's half and half. The South is in a different schedule. But look at a globe, and you'll notice that overwhelmingly the land mass of the planet is north of the equator. We are, with a very small fraction of our land mass is south of the equator. So on balance, the planet greens up in the spring and summer, and that CO2 that comes in is absorbed by the plants, and the curve goes down. And then come the winter, the fall and winter, those plants and those trees, they lose their leaves, and they give off that much of that carbon that they had sequestered, that they had trapped, and so it goes back up. But the important thing is that it climbs just like this. But it turns out that the other interesting factor is not just the change in plant life, but can you imagine the Dust Bowl affecting that? Right? Whole regions of our country no longer had vegetation, right? And therefore no absorption, no sequestration of carbon. So 1934 was warm, but there's another effect, and it's an effect we'll touch on in a moment. It's called the Albedo Effect. And albedo is a measure, it comes from the Latin word for white, and it's a measure of the reflective character of the surface of the Earth. And so if the Earth is green, it absorbs the sun's rays and transforms that energy. If the Earth is reflective, it bounces that energy right back into the atmosphere where it is increasingly trapped. We'll talk about that in a different way when we talk about the melting of the ice. It's just the reverse kind of effect, but keep that albedo in mind. Okay. We're still on the whole business of denial, and the denial industry has worked for a long time, as I say, as recently as a year ago. About 50% of Americans really believed that the scientific community was divided. Now, the next question The first question was, what's the spiritual challenge? And the second question was, what's the deal with denial? And the third question I've already touched on a little bit, but it is, what do you mean by good science and what do you mean by bad? It's interesting that the deniers don't want to be called deniers, they want to be called skeptics. But I would argue that good science has as its sort of cornerstone skepticism. Right? A good scientist is skeptical. A good scientist wants to see data before she believes or before he believes that a theory that's under consideration might have some validity. So a good scientist is a skeptic. A bad scientist is an ideologue. And you know, we often use that term ideology to mean just another philosophy. You have an ideology, I have an ideology, you have an ideology. Actually, I like to point out that if you use the word correctly, if somebody talks about your ideology, or heaven forfend, if somebody calls you an ideologue, you have been insulted if they know what it means, which drops it down to about 50% chances. But an ideologue is the classic person whose mind is made up, don't bother him or her with the facts, right? An ideologue is one who is so certain of a philosophical or scientific or spiritual point of view that no new information can possibly penetrate. That's ideology. Bad scientists are ideologues. They're searching, right, for the latest bit of data or the latest apparent contradiction in what the other side has to say that will buttress their shakier and shakier point of view. That's not good science. The other characteristic, and this I think is very telling, and you really see it in the Deniers of evolution, the Discovery Institute, for example, does no actual scientific investigation. They do not hypothesize, they do not make predictions, they do not test the predictions, they don't do field work. And might there, if the Earth is only 6,000 years old, might there be evidence? Right? The other side that says the Earth is 5 billion years old and the universe is between 13 and 15 billion years old has abundant evidence. And from so many different fields that all reinforce each other. You understand, you can't do geology today without knowing something about quantum theory. And you can't do chemistry without knowing something about physics. And you can't do biology without having someone around that knows something about all of these fields. And they reinforce each other as we move toward a more and more symbiotic, let's say, model of the universe. That, by the way, is why I've been arguing, actually this has been more of a prayer, but I've been arguing that God must one day, if God is, as we imagine, if God is fair and fairness personified, John Rawls wanted to argue that, the great philosopher, that God is above all fair. If God is fair, sooner or later God is going to say, it occurs to me that those of you who believe that the Earth is only 6,000 years old deny not only biology, but quantum physics. And if you deny quantum physics, then in principle, you deny the very principles that make it possible for you to have a plasma TV. Therefore, fiat, your plasma TV doesn't work anymore. And one day, and so they're all waiting for the rapture. Instead, I'm waiting for the day when around the world, plasma TVs, not everybody's, yours is okay, but your neighbor's plasma TV may just shut down, because if you don't believe in quantum physics, you shouldn't be able to have one. Now, do you understand? I'm not asking for federal legislation here. I'm just offering a little prayer. You know, God, if you have a moment. Okay, so that's skepticism and so on. Bad science is relying on isolated scientific arguments and ignoring the consensus. Now, by the same token, relying on the consensus and ignoring challenges would be bad science. But those who are advocates of anthropogenic climate change, for example, when Al Gore got the Nobel Prize, so did the IPCC. And I think this is a wonderful thing, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change out of the UN. And there you've got 2,500 scientists who participated, 600 who played major roles. There were disagreements, of course. There were some dissenters. But by and large, you have this incredible scientific enterprise, so many different fields, so much vetting, so much cross-checking of data, and so on. And they came up with a very conservative sort of reading of the whole thing, in which they said for the first time, we are certain at the 90% level that global climate change is anthropogenic, but we are extremely certain, that takes it up to the 96% level, we are extremely certain that it is real and that it is a very serious problem. Just to give you an idea of what scientists, good scientists, mean when they say we're very certain, recently a scientist, this is actually about 5 years ago, a very, very distinguished scientist who works for CERN, the particle accelerator in Switzerland that's just about to open up its new particle accelerator that's going to be so exciting to everyone except for the people at Fermilab who are rushing to get their experiments done so that they can discover the Higgs boson that has everybody in that world excited. But this scientist was asked by some news person at a press conference, isn't it true, Professor, that there is a chance that your particle accelerator might create energies at such a level that a mini black hole could be created and the entire universe could be destroyed? And instead of saying, you know, can you imagine you're the PR person and you're off stage and you're going, oh, please, God, don't let him say what I know he's going to say. He thinks for a minute and he goes, well, yes, of course, this is a possibility. And then he goes on to say, but it's not very likely. You know, what do you think the press printed? You know, possibility that CERN will destroy universe. So, by the way, in case you're worried, the PR department really made it their position on this clear, and scientists, nobody is allowed to talk to the press that has any problem with denying the possibility, even though there was apparently a big meeting and they're all saying, well, but it is possible. It's vanishingly small, but, you know, and so there, anyway. Science, good science. Studies that do no original work but merely critique the work of others. I mentioned that before. This is called data mining. So let's say you're one of the top, you're a team, and you together have done some of the absolute groundbreaking work on global climate change. I'm not going to try to do research that challenges your work. Instead, I'm going to go over your work with a fine-tooth comb. And if ever I can find a paper that you wrote that contradicts a paper that he wrote, that's what I'm going to celebrate. And I'm going to say, see, they don't even get along. There's so much division. It's like the creationists that used to love to quote Stephen Jay Gould, right? Stephen Jay Gould, the wonderful biologist, great teacher, terrific teacher, but he never met a fellow biologist that he liked. And so he wrote paper after paper after paper saying what was wrong with everybody else's theory, and the creationists love it, right? He is the most quoted single person in creationist literature, not his own work, because he thinks creationism is bogus, but his critique of others, and so they can say the Darwinists can't stand each other. There is no cohesive theory here. This is called data mining. It is not scientific. It's not scientific research, but it's awfully persuasive to a not very scientifically educated public. You might say, but wait a minute, Galileo was doubted by the majority, and he was right. But you have to take into consideration how dramatically the whole scientific conversation has evolved since Galileo died under house arrest in 1633. The whole idea of peer review, the sharing of information. We live in the information age. And also, the other thing that has leavened the mixture is legions of hungry PhD students. And there's nothing more desperate than a PhD student in quest of a dissertation topic. And if there's a flaw in global climate change theory, don't you think that there are already at least 10 brilliant young scholars who are on the case? The fact that there is convergence says volumes more than it said at the time of Galileo. Do you understand? To make that comparison is invalid. It's a totally invalid comparison. Okay, understanding the nature of science. What are the bad arguments? I said bad science. I'm going to just throw them out. Number one is that it's a hoax. Now, I've discredited myself by saying in the blurb I sent in that Senator James Inhofe was a senator from Nebraska. I know full well that the senators from Nebraska are the Democrat Ben Nelson and the Republican Chuck Hagel, and I was thinking about Chuck Hagel when I wrote this. Inhofe is from Oklahoma, with apologies to Oklahoma. And until January, Jim Inhofe was, get this, chair of the Senate Environmental Committee. And he is the #1 Holocaust denier in public life today, and he is famous for saying global warming is a hoax. Now, do you understand what a misunderstanding of the nature of the scientific enterprise is involved there? Okay, I'm going to stipulate, it might be wrong. I pray that we're wrong, although we already have plenty of information to confirm that we're not wrong. But let's say we're wrong. But to say that it's a hoax means that it's a conspiracy, you see? And it's a conspiracy that involves, at the very least, I mean, there are a lot of people that are probably willing to doubt the integrity of an Al Gore, although I'm certainly not among them, but to doubt the integrity of 2,500 of the most prominent climate scientists in the world who have given their, more or less, given their approval to the IPCC report. To say that there is scientific convergence, a lot of disagreement, but general scientific convergence, it's real bad. It's anthropogenic, it's getting worse, we're running out of time to do something about it. Most would say we have a window of 10 to 20 years in which to make very serious changes about the way we think about climate and about energy, and to begin to do the necessary things. That's a very short window of opportunity, broad general agreement about that, but to say it's a hoax, do you realize what you're saying about the state of American and planetary, not just American of course, American, European, Asian information exchange, and what you're saying about the nature of the scientific community? But here's the irony. These very people that deny the validity of theories of global climate change do it, even though they impugn the very nature of science by doing it, they always do it by trotting out a scientist. Right? They always have a scientist. The creationists that deny the validity of biology, right, always bring out a biologist to testify. And there are plenty of biologists that can be persuaded to offer that testimony, but never the majority. When Michael Bea, who is a biologist at Pennsylvania University, when he testified in the Dover, Pennsylvania intelligent design trial, where several parents sued because the school board had mandated the teaching of intelligent design, and the parents won, and it was reversed. When he testified, saying that there was serious doubt about Darwinian theory and so on, and intelligent design was at least as good a theory as evolution, his 18 colleagues on the faculty of his university biology department wrote a deposition saying, "We think the world of Michael, but we disagree with him completely. His testimony does not reflect consensus in the biological community, and it does not at all reflect even conversations in our department." Right? But you can always find a Michael Bea. You can always find that scientist that will testify. Using a handful to counter the global convergence of experts. Another argument is that this is all natural. You've heard this a million times. It's natural. There have always been cycles of warming and cooling. That's exactly right. The last most dramatic cycle is well back in the period of the Middle Pleistocene, when mean planetary temperature, even though that's the Ice Age, this was a period, Pleistocene was punctuated, by periods, interglacial periods where it got very warm. And in the middle of the Middle Pleistocene, temperature went up 3 degrees Fahrenheit, just Fahrenheit, measly degrees, not those big honking centigrade degrees. These are just little Fahrenheit degrees, about half the size, 3 of them, 3 degrees Fahrenheit. It meant this. It meant that in the Middle Pleistocene, there was no summer ice anywhere. Not Greenland, not the Antarctic, not the Arctic, certainly no glacier. There was no summer ice anywhere. The estimate of sea level rise during the Middle Pleistocene is 80 feet. 80 feet. Now you just take an 80-foot sea level rise. Do you understand if we get a 20-foot sea level rise, about 2/5 of Florida is gone. The whole area of Shanghai, gone. The area around Beijing, where millions of people live, gone. All of the inhabited islands in the ocean, gone completely. And every landmass you can think of, absolutely devastated. And in something that means something perhaps to Americans these days, the new proposed memorial site for the World Trade Center will be way, way, way underwater with a 20-foot increase. Imagine 80, and that was 3 degrees Fahrenheit. We are already, by the way, just for your information, in the how bad is it department, we're already a degree up over the last century. We have at least, and there's controversy about that, but everybody agrees it's at least a degree Fahrenheit. We got another degree Fahrenheit in the pipeline. Do you know what I mean? There's nothing we could do to back that up. It's already, processes are already in place and complete that will raise it another degree. And in order to stay at that level, 2 degrees up, we would have to cut back by tens of percent, not tenths of a percent, but whole tens of percents of global carbon dioxide. Anyway, lots of arguments. You'll hear that there's been a massive increase in solar radiation. Not true. You'll hear that the tropopause, which is that section of the atmosphere that begins at the ground and ends at the stratosphere, the troposphere, well, actually the tropopause is the line between troposphere and stratosphere. We're in the troposphere here, and the troposphere should be warming, and apparently it's not. Well, they've just, and this is 3-year-old data now, they've recalibrated the satellites that measured that and found, oh, wait a minute, the troposphere is warming, and it's warming by exactly what global warming theory predicts, and yet the argument that it's not warm and it should be is still out there. A lot of bad arguments. As I say, you can track them down. And now, what about Al? Did Al Gore deserve the Nobel Peace Prize? I will tell you that my mom hates him and was very upset that Al Gore won the Nobel Peace Prize. You know, if you were to ask her, and she's a delightful woman, and she does this really because it makes me crazy. You know, I haven't known her true politics for years, but she always picks a position that will flip me out. And it works like a charm. And she just sits there like in the catbird seat, smiling, and I go banging against the walls and behaving in a non-bodhisattva-like way again. But, you know, she loves to say, oh, Al Gore, that boob. And of course, instantly she will bring up, oh, I understand he invented the internet. What Gore actually said, by the way, if you're curious, is that when the internet was just coming of age, I was there, and it's absolutely true. He's the first one that talked about the information superhighway. His name is on all the legislation that was enabling legislation for DARPA and what became the internet. He really was there. He really did understand. He was regularly regarded in the less partisan time by both sides of the Senate as the smartest guy in the chamber. He was the go-to guy on defense and environment for his whole time in the Senate, and ever since he stepped down from his role as the next president of the United States. He introduces himself that way. He says, I'm Al Gore, and I used to be the next president of the United States. Ever since he stepped down from that, he has been continuing a lifelong passion, and if he doesn't deserve a prize for his extraordinary work in putting together some of the best science and also some of the best teaching about an elucidation of this, and that is a ministry, that is witness, that's a spiritual practice and social action, doing that work and taking it all over the world. But you might say, why Peace Prize? A friend of ours, I've said it in mind, won the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago. I woke up and saw the headline that said, Kenyan woman wins prize, and I said, please let it be that Kenyan woman, and please let it be that prize, and it was. It was Wangari Maathai for her work with the Kenyan Greenbelt movement, planting millions of trees in Kenya, finding work for 80,000 women, and changing in very dramatic ways the political scene in Kenya and elsewhere in Africa. But why is that peace work, people asked? Well, only people asked who hadn't thought about the connection between environment and social justice. Just consider this. The wars in the Sudan and in that part of Africa have in large measure to do with the fact that Lake Chad, which is on all your globes, is not on our globe anymore. It's gone. The Aral Sea in what used to be Soviet Central Asia. The Aral Sea is gone, right, basically. There are fishing villages that used to be right on the edge of the Aral Sea that are now hundreds of miles from the shore, and their trawlers and fishing boats and so on are stranded in deep desert sand, right? The Aral Sea is basically, what will happen when that water is completely gone? Will people fight over water? You bet, right? What about the Middle East? You create a Palestinian state. Has anyone pointed out that the Israelis control all the water? Do you think that's resolved? What happens when the ice on the Tibetan Plateau melts, and it's melting very, very rapidly now? Do you understand how many communities in India and in Indochina, as we used to call it, and in China proper, are watered by melt from the Tibetan Plateau? Do you know how many communities worldwide depend on constantly renewed glacier water for their drinking water? The glaciers are all going. Glacier National Park in 15 or 20 years will be the park formerly known as Glacier. Right? All of these are possible spurs to catastrophe, but also this. And this takes us to the next thing. My answer is yes, Al Gore absolutely deserved the prize. So did the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I think it's one of the most far-seeing prizes in history, and I'm so glad that Al Gore didn't decide, as a result of this flush of publicity, to go for a lesser prize, right? I really am glad that Al Gore is where he is. As much as others, I have no political point of view in any of this, I'm told. Anyway, I recommend that you read the book, which is extraordinary. Watch the film, share it with others. But what is the reality? I assume that you understand the basics of why there is global climate change and why greenhouse gases like CO2. People point out, well, water vapor is a greenhouse gas. Yes, but it's a greenhouse gas whose presence in our atmosphere hasn't changed. What has changed? Methane is a greenhouse gas. Yes, I heard someone not long ago saying, well, do you realize how much methane cows produce? And I countered by saying, do you have any idea how much methane termites produce? Right? Termite control, nobody is suggesting termite control is a major climate kind of strategy because termite contributions of methane are fairly steady. Here's an alarming statistic. Do you know that there are 75 pounds of termites for every man, woman, and child on Earth? Now, I'm not sure where to go to get yours if you want them, but that's a lot of termites, you know, and a lot of cattle, and yes, meat eating, as people for the ethical treatment of animals want to point out, meat eating is significant, but they're totally wrong in saying meat eating is the most significant cause of global climate change. It is vanishingly small on the list, but human-caused global climate change, or the human factor, has to do largely with carbon and other greenhouse gases, and we're only beginning to feel the effects. Still more that I said we got a degree already, another degree in the pipeline, and more coming as we begin to populate the earth with cars. Tata, one of the largest corporations in the world, an Indian corporation, has recently announced that they're going to manufacture a $2,500 automobile, a $2,500 car, and they hope that within the next year or two, they will sell 1 million of them. Right? And as India begins to generate a middle class and an upper-lower class, and as China does, and as the third world, as we no longer call it, does, of course there's an entitlement, a sense of entitlement. And where do we get off saying you people really should have light rail, right? You shouldn't have cars. Well, until and unless we begin to act, it's going to be very difficult to make that argument. But my point here is worse before better. Okay, business as usual. If we go on as usual, in 10 years, we will have carbon concentrations in the atmosphere of about 35% above 2000 levels. Above the levels of the year 2000, 35% above. Do you know why that concerns activists? Because the belief is that by that time, we will be so committed we will be so committed to the carbon economy, which we're already committed to, but we'll be so adjusted to the reality and the increasing pain that it will be impossible for us to generate the political will to turn around. That's why they say you've got a 10-year window of opportunity. Al Gore says this too, and this is very chilling. There's two canaries in the coal mine. Two canaries. One is the Arctic, and the other is the Antarctic. Recently, a British judge found 9 flaws in Al Gore's book, and they were looking for permission to circulate it in British schools, and he said, okay, but only with a disclaimer. By the way, the Gore group has already released detailed responses to all 9 of the goofy objections of the judge. He said, among other things, you couldn't prove that the disappearance of snow from Kilimanjaro, we were just in Kenya not long ago, and everywhere you go there are drawings and paintings of snowy Kilimanjaro. And then you look out the window and there is absolutely bare, dry Kilimanjaro, no glaciers, no snow left. And the judge said, we can't prove that there's a connection here. Here is the picture now. Imagine the same thing is happening along all the borders. This is the de-icification of Greenland, and it looks like that now, right? If Greenland goes, and one of the reasons that we're concerned is there's a feedback problem, as the ice melts and as the protective layer of snow that is laid down every year by the winter is less and less because it's warmer, so you get less snow, you have the albedo effect. It used to be that that protective layer of bright, sparkly snow would bounce the sun's rays right back out and off, right? But as that snow melts or doesn't fall at all, you know what's exposed? The blue, and then the gray, and then the black ice, the dirty, dirty ice, and it's the difference between wearing a white t-shirt on a hot day and a black one, right? You know you're wearing that black t-shirt because it is slimming, and you look so much better in the black t-shirt, and you're dying because it's 110 degrees and you should have come to your senses. Well, that's what happens. Instead of being absorbed, that snow, and it would have been covered. I mean, that ice would have been covered for most of the season with new snow, but that's the thing of the past. That ice now begins to melt, and when it does, what we have is pooling of lakes on the surface of the glaciers, on the surface of the permanent ice, and those lakes melt. I mean, the ice melts and melts and melts until finally you don't have a lake, you have a turbulent, churning drill. I've seen footage of one of these in the Arctic, and it is drilling right down to the bedrock. And when it does, that water, it's called a moulin, a mill, because the water churns. And no, they don't say moulin, and they say moulin. But anyway, it churns, and it gets under the ice, in between the ice and the bedrock, where it acts like ball bearings. And the whole process of melt and break off is tremendously exacerbated. If Greenland goes, sea levels worldwide will rise without question. It's very simple. It's the difference between an ice cube that's in a glass, that's sitting in the glass. When it melts, it doesn't raise the level of your drink, right? But if you had a bunch of ice cubes and one on top of the whole stack that wasn't in the water, when it melts, your glass will overflow, right? So we know that Greenland melts 20 feet. But there's also Antarctica, and it's melting. Not as fast as Greenland, but fast. And the West Antarctic ice shelf has already been showing very troubling signs. If the West Antarctic ice shelf, about a third of the mass of Antarctica, if it goes, sea levels right now, 20 feet up. That's 2 possible sources of a 20-foot increase. Half of Greenland, half of the West Antarctic ice shelf. 2 canaries in the coal mine, 2 things worth your attention. That's the reality. What's the hope? My major research, and this will wind us up, my major research for the last several years has been pretty much on one of the themes that Jean Houston talked about, that we are at that sacred moment, this moment of possibility and hope. I've chosen, because I like Shakespeare and I'm inspired by him, and he coined a term that's become part of our language, and that term is sea change. And I believe we're on the threshold of a sea change, that we're living in an age of dramatically accelerated cultural value shift. moving in the direction of a better understanding and more concern with and address to social and economic justice, human rights, and yes, ecology. Transformation of the rights of women, I could go on and on. That's happening now. I'm going to make a prediction, and that prediction is that for the first time ever in a presidential campaign in 2008, the environment, but particularly the whole idea of anthropogenic global climate change, will be one of the biggest of all of the campaign issues. Already that is the case. It is building. The media is paying attention to it. A number of media outlets have produced very detailed studies. Where does your candidate stand on global climate change? And that's an intriguing thing. I bet you could guess. And finally, what's the spiritual response? Tomorrow I'll talk about it in more detail, and I think that will fit what you have in mind, David, as we all together try to put our heads together and say what sort of pledges, what can we carry out from this? And for me, the response has to be a spiritual response. I don't make a distinction between contemplation and action. I was reminded by John Algio's talk last night of St. Teresa, who used to tell her nuns, if you stay in meditation all the time, it's no good. If you go out on the streets without the preparation of prayer and contemplation, she would have said contemplation, it's no good. You have to steep yourself in contemplation and take it to the streets and work with the poor. There is finally no difference between contemplation and action. They're two sides of the same coin. So I talk about clarification, centering, and service. Clarification means get it straight. Right? Get it straight. There's probably no issue that is more important than this one. Right? Learn why it is that the old division that was so powerful 10 years ago between the tree huggers and the people huggers, they used to not be able to stand the sight of each other. At the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, they were divided completely. At the 10 years out, revamp or rehash of the Earth Summit held in Johannesburg in 2002, it was all different. And the tree huggers and the people huggers were realizing that they're all earth huggers and that the one can't live without the other. That's changing. Clarify, understand that, learn why that is. Introduce yourself to the skeptics. Don't be afraid of the skeptics. They don't have secret information, right? They have information that has been taken out of context, distorted, or flat made up, right? Get to know, I don't mean invite them over, but get to know, and sure, why not? Why not? Get to know the arguments of the skeptic and choose one a week or one a month as your little research project. Centering, and you've all got practice, you've all got spiritual practice or you wouldn't be here. Introduce into your spiritual practice that element of centering and healing the earth and the planetary community, because it's not only the earth that is in pain. Think about all the people who are already in pain. Pacific Islanders who are picking up everything they own and moving to New Zealand where they are not being welcomed, right? Why? Because their shoreline is eroding and their homes will soon be gone. Think about the suffering that is caused already by drought. Global warming will cause immense sucking up of moisture and immense precipitation. You're going to have more rain and precipitation than in any time we have ever measured. And that sounds like good news, but it's not, because who knows where the rain's going to go. But you can be pretty sure of this, the rain is not likely to fall in the place that just got sucked dry of its last moisture, because there's not a bit of green left to hold the water in. Think about the people who won't have enough water to drink. Right? Think about that. And finally, service. Find something to do. Fix your home. Right? Fix your car, fix your home. Look into the whole business of carbon set-asides. Right? Look into the whole business of carbon replacement. In other words, pay for the carbon you use by funding some program somewhere. They're easy to find. There are a dozen websites that are doing this. Do a little research and find out how you could pay a nominal fee that would help offset carbon use in some other area or in industry and so on that pays for the carbon that you use. Take it to your community. Be a voice in your community. Don't have to ring doorbells, but bring it up if it doesn't come up naturally. And finally, when you vote, and when you vote with your funds and with your money and you support causes and NGOs and so on, keep global climate change in mind. But pick a candidate with a brain, and pick a candidate with a heart, and pick a candidate that knows that we live on a fragile planet.